Hi there, everybody. Today, this video is going to start our first video series on Descartes' meditations. In this video, we're just going to introduce the predicament that Descartes finds himself in at the beginning of the meditations. Then we'll talk about an idea known as foundationalism that seems to sort of inform that project that he takes on. Then we'll talk about the debate between empiricism and rationalism. And then I'll give you a very extremely quick summary of the meditations. So the first meditation starts out with the following quote. It says, "Several years have now passed since I first realized how numerous were the false opinions that in my youth I had taken to be true, and thus how doubtful were all those that I had subsequently built upon them." So Descartes lived at the beginning of the scientific revolution. People like Copernicus and Galileo were developing a new idea where the universe operated very differently. They put forward a sort of mechanistic view of the physical world around us, where everything operated on these sort of purely mechanical sort of processes. Think of it as like pushes and pulls and levers being pulled to explain all of the movement of the planets, etc. And the big thing there that obviously you sort of hear about is Galileo proposed that we were wrong. The Earth is not the center of the universe, and the sun does not revolve around the Earth. Rather, the Earth revolves around the sun. And this had drastic sort of implications for trying to understand ourselves and our place in the world, especially within a religious context. Descartes bought into this new science. In fact, he sort of wrote a defense of Galileo's picture of the universe, but he chose not to publish it because he saw Galileo go on trial and essentially be put on house arrest until his death by the church because of his teachings. So Descartes, one way to read the meditations is a kind of defense of Galileo's physics, but in a way that is hidden from view, so as to try to protect himself. Now, but he thought, look, a lot of the stuff that he had been taught turned out to be wrong. But a lot of things that he believes now is also a result of that same sort of teaching and same sort of education sort of process. And so how could he trust that the new beliefs that he was forming were actually true? How could he be confident that the rug wouldn't just be pulled out from underneath him again? And so he claims, I realized that once in my life I had to raise everything to the ground. So he has to throw out all these beliefs since they're sort of doubtful. And he needs to begin again from the original foundations. Why does he need to do that? He needs to do that if he ever wants to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. So he actually wants to be certain that his beliefs, his understanding of sort of the world around him is actually true, then he needs to make sure that all of that is sort of traced back to a solid foundation. So this talk of a foundation of a knowledge is related to the following idea. So we often try to support our beliefs by appealing to an argument from other beliefs we hold. So if I believe some claim Z, you might ask me, well, how do you know that, Sam? And sometimes I'll try to support my belief by giving you an argument. I might say, Y, therefore Z. So I give you a premise and I come to the conclusion Z that I was trying to sort of support, and that's supposed to show you how I know that Z is true. But an argument only gives us knowledge of its conclusion if its logic is good, and we know that its premises are true. So consider again that argument, Y therefore Z. That argument only gives me knowledge of that conclusion if I know that the premise Y is true, and obviously only if the argument's logic is good as well. But now you might sort of say, well, how do I know that the premises of my argument are true? I could try to support my belief in those premises, Y, by giving a new argument. I might say, well, how do I know why? Well, because X. That's how I know it. But the same issue arises. How do I know that this new premise is true? How do I know X? If I continue to appeal to arguments, that process is just going to repeat over and over and over. This is what's known as the epistemic regress problem. When someone asks why and I sort of give a new belief, I give an argument, that just creates a regress where I have to appeal to another argument, and then another argument, and then another argument. And it just keeps going back and back. I keep regressing down my beliefs. Now, once we start giving that chain of reasons to support our beliefs, it seems as if there are three possibilities. Maybe my beliefs just keep going on infinitely. I keep giving more reasons and more reasons and more reasons forever. Or maybe my chain of reason sort of circles back on itself. You say, Sam, how do you know A? I say, well, that's supported by B. You say, how do you know B? Well, I say, well, that's supported by C. You say, how do you know C? I say, well, that's supported by A. And now notice I've just gone back in a circle. So I don't have to go through an infinite number of reasons. I've just sort of circled back on myself. Or alternatively, maybe eventually I get to a belief without circling and I just stop. Eventually I reach a belief that I have that's not supported by any argument and it's not supported by any other belief that I hold. So this is like when the kid just sort of keeps asking why. You could sit there asking why forever. You might sort of circle back and just sort of give the same explanation again, or eventually you might just sort of say, because that's the way it is. You just sort of stop the conversation. All right, so this leads to a regress argument for the idea that knowledge requires a foundation. So the claim here is that if humans have any knowledge, then it comes from either one of these three sources: an infinite chain of reasons, a circular chain of reasons, or some foundational knowledge. But the idea is, look, we can't get knowledge from an infinite chain of reasons because we're sort of finite creatures. We're just not able to go through an infinite number of arguments to get to our beliefs. We would just never stop justifying our beliefs. We never get done with that process. Humans also, you might think, can't gain knowledge from a circular chain of reasons. You can't use A to justify A. Thus, that is, if humans have any knowledge, it seems like there needs to be some sort of foundation, some place where we can start and then use that to hold up our other knowledge. Now, Descartes accepts this picture and often explains it with a kind of architecture analogy. He says every building requires a foundation to support it. Similarly, all knowledge requires some starting beliefs that are not supported by any other beliefs or argument. Rather, they are the foundation that hold up, that we can use in arguments for other beliefs, but are not themselves held up by arguments. However, our knowledge clearly just couldn't be built on just any random starting beliefs. If the foundation of a building is insecure, if it's weak, then everything built on that foundation is also insecure and weak. Similarly, if the foundations of our beliefs are random or arbitrary, then the beliefs we build on them, using them as arguments, those resulting conclusions are also going to be random and arbitrary. Thus, if we want knowledge, we need to figure out which beliefs can legitimately be used as a secure foundation, which beliefs can be strong even if they're not supported by arguments. However, this raises the question, how could we have any assurance that a foundational belief is true? If it's not being supported by an argument or other beliefs, where does that sort of knowledge come from then? So traditionally, there are two families of views regarding the source of human knowledge: empiricism and rationalism. The empiricist view says all knowledge must ultimately be justified by sensory experience. Yes, we can go through arguments, but it is as we sort of trace back these reasons for reasons, if we're going to know these conclusions, they need to eventually trace back to some sensory experience that gives us our first beliefs. It's the sensory experience that justifies those beliefs, and then once we get those, we can use them in arguments to develop our theories. Rationalism, on the other hand, says that, well, at least some of our knowledge is ultimately justified by our reason as opposed to our sensory experience. Now, Descartes, at the beginning of the Meditations, seems to think that we commonly assume some kind of empiricism, that our knowledge starts with sensory experience. But when he starts with that assumption, he thinks that that leads to a sort of big problem, which is essentially, he thinks it leads to skepticism. And so he thinks that we need to reject empiricism. And in order to avoid skepticism, in order to make sure that we actually have some knowledge, he thinks some of our beliefs need to ultimately be justified by our reason, since sensory experience just isn't up to the job. Right. So one of the central conclusions then that Descartes wants the reader to draw is that our knowledge ultimately comes from our using reason and not from our sensory experience. Now, Descartes attempts to get to this sort of position, get out of his predicament and find a firm and permanent foundation in reason by adopting a two-stage project. The first is a destructive stage. This is where he hopes to knock down and rid himself of his current beliefs so that the only things he sort of knows for certain are the ones that sort of remain at the end of the destruction process. So he's sort of clearing the ground with bulldozers. Then once he's cleared the ground and found a sort of solid foundation, he can then start building again. So he'll take the knowledge that survives that destruction and use it to help him rebuild his beliefs in a way that's sort of much stronger than before. All right, so now this leads us to a quick summary of the meditations. So in meditation 1, Descartes is going to raise skepticism for sensory and mathematical beliefs. Then meditation 2 is going to be Descartes attempting to reveal that we have knowledge of our own mind. And then he's going to attempt to clarify our idea of our mind and of our body. Then meditation 3 has Descartes reflecting on, well, what's required for us to have certainty? And then he uses this in a way to sort of aim to prove God's existence. Then in meditation 4, he attempts to explain, well, why is it that humans sort of make mistakes? Where do our errors come from? He says, these errors are the result of people misusing our will. Meditation 5 defends a theory of essences and uses it in a new argument for God. And meditation 6 uses God to argue for the reliability of our senses and then provides an argument for mind-body dualism. To relate this back to the two-stage process, meditation 1 is the destructive phase of that project. It's him sort of clearing the ground, getting rid of his beliefs. But then meditations 2 through 6 are him sort of rebuilding his knowledge. Meditation 2 gives us the foundation of knowledge about our sort of own mind. Meditation 3 then sort of reconstructs knowledge of God's existence. Meditation 5, he then gets sort of mathematical beliefs back. And then meditation 6 gives us sort of essentially empirical science back by defending the reliability of our senses, which we can then describe using the mathematics. So that's all for this video. In the next video, we'll talk a bit more about Descartes' method for revealing the foundations. See you then. Bye-bye.